Paramusic TV. I'm Johnny Long. On this edition of Classic Case Review, I have decided to focus on the Bell Witch of Tennessee. Very famous case, especially in more recent years. As I've come to realize, all paranormal cases are going to draw criticism. That's just the nature of the beast. It seems in recent years there's several theories this case wasn't real at all, or certain stories that have become synonymous with the Bell Witch really didn't happen. And there's even more controversy when it comes to things that supposedly happened to the family after the case technically ended. Certain family members that even moved out of the area of Adams, Tennessee and moved to Mississippi also were experiencing bouts of activity. I mean, let's put into perspective how old this case is. It first started, depending on what account you read, late in the year of 1816 or early in 1817. There's a whole tourist industry built around Bell Witch Cave now. Now the conception is that the cave is the focus of the activity, and really it was not. It was the homestead and the surrounding land that seemed to exhibit the paranormal activity. There are no tape recordings. There's just witness testimony that's been written down. I will start with how the case began, then I will interject at certain points the controversies possibly surrounding those stories, and see if we can make any kind of headway in understanding the Bell Witch and possibly many other cases of this sort.
Follow the signs to the end of the road. Don't let the rain make you lose control. And don't be afraid when it's time to go. Just follow your signs to the end of your road.
In 1804, John Bell and his wife Lucy, along with their 5 children, braved the journey through the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina to settle in Red River, Tennessee, which would eventually become the town of Adams. For the next 12 years, the Bell family led a prosperous life. The rest of their children, Elizabeth or Betsy, Richard, and Joel, would be born. But in December of 1816, as he was returning home after checking his farmlands, John Bell spotted an unusual-looking creature in his cornfield. He described it as having the head of a rabbit and the body of a large dog. Bell shot at it, but the creature would disappear without a trace. Bell thought little of the incident until after dinner, when the entire family began to hear mysterious noises, knockings and banging sounds that could not be accounted for. As the days passed, the strange noises continued, graduating from mere knocks and bangs to the sounds of something gnawing on their bedposts, or invisible dogs fighting in an otherwise empty room. When the family was convinced these were supernatural occurrences, they vowed to say nothing to anyone. After about a year of enduring the relentless noises, the activity turned violent. Betsy Bell woke up one night when the entity was making its usual commotion. When she started to get out of bed, she found that her hair had been tied to the bedpost. Unable to move, she felt as if she were being repeatedly slapped by an unseen force. The hand-shaped welts were visible on her after the attack was over. Other members of the family would be slapped, pinched, or felt as if they had been stuck with pins. Bed sheets would be ripped off their bodies. The only one not to endure these attacks was John Bell's wife, Lucy. The family came to realize they could not keep this to themselves anymore. Like my first video about the infield poltergeist, the more you look at it, the more there seems to be a relationship. In fact, that was my intention, was to make comparisons between the infield poltergeist and the Bell Witch, because much of the same sort of phenomena happened. These entities that seem to show up and become truly disruptive forces in the lives of those involved, almost like a perfect storm of activity. And of course, it's also reminiscent of Skinwalker Ranch, where the land itself seems to exhibit all types of paranormal activity. The Bell Farm was never investigated in the way we would understand the term today. There were no parapsychologists or paranormal organizations. The only documentation that survives is literally the written word, thanks in large part to Richard Bell, who was 6 years old when the disturbances began. The first person to be told the family secret was James Johnston, their neighbor. He would stay overnight at the Bell Farm and experienced much of the same phenomenon, and surmised it was, quote, a spirit, just like in the Bible. This was not what John Bell wanted to hear. He had spent the year hiding his family's torment, in large part because he was a church elder. But Johnston talked him into speaking with Reverend Fort, pastor of the Red River Church. As it turns out, the Reverend was sympathetic and agreed to look into the matter in secret. Members of the Johnston family, Reverend Fort, and John Bell would try to communicate with the entity, and eventually began receiving answers. The voice was weak at first, described as sounding like a feeble old woman. They could not understand it, but gradually as they kept engaging it, it became stronger, and soon it was able to converse. The voice. One of the things that makes this case very unique, at least at first, and also compare it to, again, the infield poltergeist, where there was a voice involved. These people of this era did not have anything to really compare what they were experiencing to. With the infield poltergeist, which is, of course, recorded and very well documented, and we can hear it whether we believe the case or not, it still shows Janet Hodgson. It seemed to be interconnected with her in some way. Now, some accuse her, of course, of using ventriloquism, which, if you actually know how ventriloquism works, which is not moving your lips when you talk and using your tongue to make words that normally your lips would have to make, and you are trying to duplicate that sound. Now the case had reached its zenith. The entity began to focus more of its violent behavior on John Bell. Betsy would still experience slaps and hair pulling, but now she would fall into trances, frequently sleepwalk, and break into seizures. But the entity really began its assault on John Bell as he began to experience seizures, facial tics, or would become partially paralyzed and bedridden. The entity now claimed that it desired to kill John Bell, or Old Jack, as the spirit began calling him. It would infamously claim to be the spirit sent by disgruntled neighbor Kate Batts. As time passed, the entity would answer to the name of Kate. Some of the neighbors also experienced activity in their own homes. It once quoted word for word 2 church sermons preached 15 miles apart, mimicking the voices of the preachers who delivered them. Now the case was becoming famous, and people began to venture into Red River to see the Bell Witch for themselves. Let's talk about Kate Batts. The misconception concerning this is that the claim was that Kate Batts was the ghost. In other words, Kate Batts was dead and was haunting John Bell. In reality, Kate Batts was very much alive and outlived John Bell. What was actually said was that the entity was sent by Kate Batts, insinuating, of course, that she was a witch, a practicing witch. I guess Kate Batts was very strange to begin with, and was not the most educated of people, and had a tendency, they say, to use words that she didn't know the meanings of incorrectly. And it is true that John Bell and the Batts family had some difficulties in business dealings. Kate was angry about John Bell's illness. Some people believe now may have been natural, possibly Bell's palsy or a neurological disorder. We have to remember that John Bell at this point was about 68, 69 years old. Certainly at an age where these sorts of things might begin to crop up. Now, of course, Betsy Bell, let us also compare once again to Janet Hodgson, where she was also falling into seizures and the sleepwalking. And the only difference really between the things that happened to Betsy Bell and Janet Hodgson was merely the violence. I have not seen anything to indicate that Janet Hodgson was slapped or scratched or hair pulled or anything of that nature. It was mostly the sleepwalking and the seizures and, her being found in odd, strange places and weird positions that seemed impossible. It is clear that the Bell Witch definitely had an effect upon Betsy, very similar to Janet Hodgson. An Englishman, claiming to regularly visit haunted locations, was allowed to stay as long as he wished. The first 2 nights were uneventful, and then the man would come to believe nothing was happening. Then, on what was to be his last night there, the entity came to his room. He heard the voices of his parents, who still lived in England, talking about being worried about him. The next morning he would leave. He returned to England and talked to his parents. They said not only was he correct, but they heard his voice that same night as he talked to the Bell Witch. But this was not the reason for his departure. He said the entity returned a little later, and although he does not say what happened, it scared him so badly that he left right away. Then the family would be visited by General Andrew Jackson, future President of the United States. Jackson had heard about the Bell Witch and had become quite curious about it. 2 of Bell's oldest sons served with Jackson in the War of 1812. he would bring a few of his men from Nashville, 2 days' ride from Red River. Not long after entering the Bell property, one of his men began to brag about being a, quote, witch tamer, and that he had brought special bullets that he claimed would kill the spirit. Then suddenly Jackson's wagon stopped moving. The wheels were locked and would not roll, no matter how hard his men pushed. Jackson proclaimed this must be the work of the witch. Then from the forest the voice called out to Jackson, telling him he could now move on, and it would see him at the farm. Indeed, the wagon was able to move again, and they continued. After their arrival, Jackson reacquainted himself with his former soldiers, and regaled the family with some of his war stories. During this time, as seemed to be the pattern of the entity, nothing happened. Then, the same man who claimed to be a witch tamer began to boast that the reason nothing was happening was because the witch was afraid of him. Jackson challenged a man to do whatever he wished, for he wanted to see the spirit do something. Then the man began to act as if he were being beaten, and repeatedly stuck with pins. Then the spirit grabbed his nose, forcing him out the door, which slammed shut behind him. Then the voice proclaimed that the man was a fraud. It told Jackson if he would stay at least one more night, she would expose yet another. Of course, Jackson's men were begging to leave, but Jackson wanted to know who these men were and insisted that they stay. But when the family awoke the next morning, Jackson's unit was seen leaving, already packed and heading back to Nashville. It is said something else happened to change Jackson's mind, but it is unknown what that was. Jackson was later quoted as saying he would rather face the entire British Army than to deal with the Bell Witch again. The story, of course, of Andrew Jackson visiting the Bell Farm is probably the most hotly debated story of the entire case. Most believe that it didn't happen because there are no documents supporting this. In other words, Jackson's movements are pretty well documented through this point of his life, and there is nothing that mentions him making a visit to the Bell Farm or having, even in his own diaries, any account of this story. Documentation is a great thing, and it's always great to have stories verified, but do we really have to wonder why he may not have mentioned this, or that the entire visit was unrecorded in the history books? I don't think so. Another portion of this that has come to light is that he also owned property just a few miles away from the Bell Farm. So you have not only the fact that John Bell's sons served with Jackson, which is verified, that did happen. He also had land that he occasionally probably needed to check up on, and probably did, who knows how often. But to me, where there's smoke, there's fire. He was somewhat acquainted with the family, and if he'd heard the rumors, it does seem likely that he might have wanted to go see what was going on. So I personally believe that this did happen, and the fact that it's not documented in either the military records or his own personal diaries really doesn't surprise me. But I don't think that that negates the possibility that it happened. This was the life of the Bell family for 3 years. The only one to avoid the wrath of the entity was Lucy Bell, whom the entity claimed was, quote, the kindest person on earth. It would even help to nurse her through a fever by materializing various fruits and nuts, some of which were not even indigenous to the area, and singing soothing songs. But no such kindness was given to John Bell in the midst of his illness, and when Betsy Bell was being courted by Joshua Gardner, It showed its objection to the union by constantly beating up on her when they were together, and even pleaded with her not to marry him. In December of 1820, the witch would accomplish at least one of its goals. John Bell would take to his bed one more time after suffering a series of seizures, and would slip into a coma. On the 20th of December, he would be found dead. Shortly after discovering the body, John Bell Jr. noticed a foul odor emanating from his father's mouth. They would find a bottle amongst his medicines that was not there before. It contained a smoky-colored liquid with the same smell. Then the voice of the entity rang out with delight, saying it made John Bell swallow this concoction, claiming responsibility for his death. To test this liquid, a small dose was given to their cat, upon which swallowing went into a short fit and died. At John Bell's funeral, the voice interrupted the proceedings with shouts of joy at his death, singing bawdy drinking songs during the entirety of the ceremony. Betsy Bell would break off her engagement to Joshua Gardner after the constant harassment by the entity, fearing Joshua might suffer a similar fate to her father's if the relationship continued. After this, the entity known as Kate informed the family it was leaving, but would return in 7 years, a promise it apparently kept, though only briefly. Now, of course, the million-dollar question. Did the Bell Witch actually kill John Bell? Was John Bell murdered by a ghost? I don't think so. The entity did take credit for it. I don't know if there was any planning on somebody else's part conspiring with the witch to, murder John Bell. But I mean, think about it in the terms of, if you wanted to kill somebody and you had an entity that already didn't like the person that you wanted to kill and it was willing to take the blame, you can't arrest a ghost. No justice can be served as long as everybody thinks that that's what happened, and the ghost took complete credit for it. But I also have to ask, why would a ghost use probably arsenic? Why would it need to poison somebody? The Bell Witch is the only case in which a ghost has possibly caused the death of a person. Why would that be? I don't think spirits usually are allowed to outright kill. I think they can wear you down, which I think the Bell Witch did to John Bell. It wore him down. I think he already had an illness. The Bell Witch took advantage of that. Relentless with, the beatings and ripping your bed sheets off of you as you're trying to sleep. That's wearing you down. In 1828, the entity returned, appearing to John Bell Jr., with whom the spirit had a fairly amicable rapport. For 3 weeks, it would speak with him about spiritual matters, even making predictions, most notably about the American Civil War, still 30 years away. Then it would leave again, stating that it would return in 107 years, to John Jr.'s nearest descendant. That would mean the spirit should have returned by 1935 and should have appeared to Charles Bailey Bell, Although Charles did write a book about the Bell Witch, it does not seem to have kept its promise to return, if indeed it truly ever left. Paranormal activity is still reported around the area of the old Bell Farm, but the center of attraction is the cave. Although the original legend has only one story involving the cave, there are reports of activity there now. Legend has it that you should not take anything from the cave, such as rocks, or bad luck will befall you. Paranormal groups have investigated the cave and captured many pieces of evidence in the form of orbs and EVPs. But is the Bell Witch still there? Perhaps she is, but chooses to remain silent until she finds someone else to torment.